Welcome back. We're not doing a new episode of the pre-war origins of the post-war order yet. We're going to take a foray off into another interesting topic that will hopefully be timely and relevant and useful and interesting and all that other good stuff. First off, let me say that I've got a little bit of music playing in the background. This is Night Drive. This is a synthwave selection by my friend Amid the Ruins 1453. And, I like him and I like his music. And I thought that I might play it softly in the background here and maybe you would enjoy it as well. You can check out his channel on YouTube, and I think he has a page on Bandcamp as well. So support him and support his music. Okay, what we're going to be talking about today is fascism. We're going to be talking about fascism and Neofascism, and particularly we're going to read an article by one of the foremost scholars of fascism in the West and one of the most honest academics that I've come across who is still currently working. If you know anything about academia, if you've been in it yourself, got personal experience with it, it is working in academia today is kind of like being an academic in the Soviet Union, in which in order to keep your job, you have got to promote the ideology of the ruling class, the ruling elite, and the government structure. In the Soviet Union, that was Marxism-Leninism. In America, it is liberal internationalism and, neoliberalism, but it's somewhere between neoliberalism and cultural Marxism. You can be one of those two. If you want to be a pariah, you can be a conservative. If you're anything to the right of a civic nationalist conservative, you might as well just quit. Okay, so those are your three options basically: neoliberal, cultural Marxist, or conservative as pariah. So James A. Gregor, his real name is something like Anthony Gamiglione or something. He's an Italian. You can tell from his physiognomy here that he is a Southern European or a Mediterranean person. For reasons unknown to me, he changed his name to A. James Gregor. He's 90 years old. He's still alive. And the fact that he's so old means that he actually had personal relations with a lot of the people who were involved in fascism or people who lived in that era. So he himself is a cultural artifact that goes way back. We're not talking here about one of these Bugman journalists who is 23 years old, doesn't know anything, has a journalism degree, doesn't know anything about history, and just recycles World War II propaganda, basically. So we're going to go through quickly a couple of slides here. Let me turn the music up just a little bit. Okay, so we've got a picture here in front of us of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, the Führer and the Duce. And these guys are representative to pretty much everybody of fascism. This is what fascism is whatever these two guys said. We can all, or most of us, pretty much everybody, even educated persons, would agree that what these guys said and did was fascism. Everything else, who knows, but what these guys said for sure. You will also hear from conservatives that Barack Obama, who looks sort of diabolical, kind of like some sort of Bela Lugosi type individual in this here, that he's got a National Socialist swastika, he's got an Islamic crescent, communist hammer and sickle, and then his industrial development, infrastructural development stuff, peace, hope, change, whatever. So apparently he's a fascist too, at least according to some people. This is a really cringeworthy meme that I found just looking on the internet briefly to see what people were saying about fascism. Ronald Reagan says, if I stand in front of this huge flag, maybe they won't notice I'm a fascist. So Ronald Reagan, an anti-communist, free market, for the most part, tough on unions, fascist. Okay. Sarah Palin, quote, "When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross." Sinclair Lewis. Now, whoever came up with this really cringeworthy meme didn't know that Sinclair Lewis lived in 1935, not 1835. So it's just a complete mess. But they're saying that Sarah Palin, who most people thought was just an attractive conservative woman, Zio-conservative, kosher conservative, apparently she's a fascist too, according to some people. And then this is a step up here. So what your teacher told you, what the academics told you, was that there's two sides of the political spectrum. There's communist on one side, there's fascist on the other. Fascist or extreme right wing. Okay, this is what you will get in college and in most educational places. This is what most liberals believe. And then the second part of this diagram, reality, is that libertarianism and anarchy are right wing, kind of strange. And then on the extreme left wing, you have communism and fascism, because they're both totalitarian. So this is actually very common, both of these views. These views are common, and the bottom one is common among people who've thought about this a bit more but aren't leftists themselves. And then this Lionel Hutz meme, college professors be like, Nazi kills 11 million people, worst thing ever. Joseph Stalin, communist who kills over 20 million people. And the college professor says, well, this system needs some work. So this is kind of goofy, but this is real. These are all issues that James Gregor, is going to talk about in this paper that we're going to read. So we're going to start out from the position that we really don't know what fascism is. Some of you may not have some ideas in your mind about corporatism and state intervention, but as far as what any normal person will tell you about fascism, it's all over the place. Fascism is whatever they don't like. That's the key idea. Let's see. So we got rid of that. This is going to be the first chapter of his book called Searching for Neofascism. Chapter 1, The Decay of an Empire. In the course of the closing decade of the 20th century, a dedicated minority of journalists and academics decided that the rise of quote-unquote neo-fascism posed a serious threat to public decency and political integrity in the Western industrialized democracies. One consequence was that by the first years of the 21st century, literally hundreds of books and articles dedicated to some sort of treatment of the subject had appeared. Their intended purpose was to warn society of the insidiousness of the peril. Let me point out here briefly that this book was written in 2006, or rather it was published in 2006, so it was probably written in 2003 or 4. So this is during the Bush era, and I'm sure that if we went back and looked, we could find a lot of liberals, a lot of leftists, a lot of journalists and academics saying that George Bush was a fascist. During the Trump era, George Bush was viewed to be a very open-minded liberal person, and Trump was viewed to be a fascist. So this chapter that I'm reading to you, this article, is incredibly timely and fresh for this reason, because you're just seeing even today a recycling of the same stuff that happened 10 years ago, and of course goes all the way back to 1933 at the absolute latest, and it was really in place even before that. But 1932-33 is really when this journalistic program started. Continuing with the text, for these works to have accomplished their purpose, one would have expected some indication of what quote-unquote neo-fascism meant, followed by a serious treatment of the candidate neo-fascisms that constituted the menace. Unhappily, little of the former is to be found in many, if not most, works, and without even lexical definition, it is difficult to isolate the proper objects of concern. So he's saying that the people who are talking about neo-fascism and the dangers of neo-fascism don't tell you what it is. They assume that you know. They assume that you have the same idea. And so it's very difficult to find out if this threat is out there because we don't know what they're talking about. It often appears, however, that however quote-unquote neo-fascism is defined, its relationship to Benito Mussolini's fascism remains, at best, obscure. An often unspoken assumption functions as part of the sorting criteria in identifying neo-fascism. Most of the authors who have surfaced within the past 2 decades choose to fuse fascism, National Socialism, and the political right together into a single subject category, usually identified as either quote-unquote fascism, quote-unquote neo-fascism, or, this is key for us, quote, right-wing extremism, end quote, as though all constituted a single reference class. The consequence has been considerable confusion with uncertainty concerning the class of political movements and/or ideologies that constitute the proper objects of scrutiny. So this is really important, okay? This is what happens all the time. You read the journalists, you read the academics, you read the politicians, even Donald Trump, the president, I'm sure would do this if you asked him. There's no difference in their mind between right-wing extremism, fascism, white supremacy. These are all a convoluted and complex set of interrelated political ideologies that at the end of the day are basically all the same thing. They come from the same places and they all need to be exterminated. Absolutely exterminated. So conservatives have to be pariahs, but these other people have to be either killed or locked up, or just totally forced, into poverty and self-destruction, right? Back to the text. The issue is not simply academic. The identification, for instance, of the Silvio Berlusconi government of the Italian Republic as neo-fascist is a matter of no small consequence. That government has been an important ally of the United States in a variety of international circumstances. Its description as quote-unquote neo-fascist not only prejudices that relationship, but taints the actions that is a byproduct of that relationship. So if it's true that the Italian government of Berlusconi is neo-fascist or fascist in some sense, then it means that the United States is perfectly happy to work with a fascist government. So that presents very strange problems for liberal ideology. Maybe not Marxist ideology, but liberal ideology. More immediately, the identification of any political movement as quote-unquote neo-fascist tends to limit its moral right to free expression. Any and all political movements, however eccentric, have every legal right to such expression in a representative democracy. Everyone acknowledges that the exercise of those rights is difficult for dissident movements. To insist on their quote-unquote neo-fascism further reduces their opportunity to gain access to a public hearing. So this is also very important. People today, because of the enormous hype over the so-called Red Scare, which in fact was total communist penetration of the American government, everybody would say, oh yeah, communists have a right to speak their mind, they have a right to campaign openly, they have a right to be in the public sphere. But many of those people who would support that statement and argue for that think that anything that's quote-unquote neo-fascist has to be driven underground and heaped with so much opprobrium that it can't be heard at all. But then, the extension of that is anything that's so-called right-wing extremist is the same and has to also be driven underground. So you can imagine how the more the Overton window shifts to the left, the more anything that's to the right or reactionary or conservative or traditional is just totally unacceptable. And in fact, that's what we've seen in the United States in the 20th century and the West in general. Other than those immediate concerns, there remain the academic responsibilities of conducting one's inquiry in accordance with generally accepted criteria of objectivity, public evidence, coherence, and consistency. Much of the subsequent discussion will trade on just those criteria. In terms of that discussion, its explicit initial contention is that the real or pretended study of quote-unquote Neofascism is inextricably related to the study of Italian fascism, in which the name finds its origin. That granted, the inquiry must commence with a synoptic study of a reasonably discrete, if enormously complicated, series of events that covered more than a quarter century of European and world history during the past century. To study Neofascism meaningfully would seem to necessitate that we know something substantial concerning fascism, at least some major elements of its peculiar history, and the ideology that animated its behavior. It might be further argued that a notion of a generic quote-unquote fascism would occupy conceptual space somewhere between Italian fascism and neo-fascism as a transitional object of reflection in any serious cognitive enterprise. It would seem that to speak of quote-unquote neo-fascism, one must entertain some notion of a generic fascism. So what he's saying here is that if you believe that there's such a thing as neo-fascism, it implies that there was a fascism in the past that this thing is related to. The historical thing had to be the fascism of Mussolini in Italy in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? Okay, and now if we know that there's two data points, one now and one then, it implies that there is some sort of basic fascism or ahistorical fascism, some sort of identifiable tenets or parts of an ideology that were expressed both then and now, but without historical continuity. So this is what this implies, according to A. James Gregor. It implies these three things. What's the problem, though? However elementary all that might appear, everything involved in the undertaking is beset by problems. Many decades after its disappearance, Mussolini's fascism continues to remain an uncertainty in the minds of many, if not most, academics. Very few have a sure grasp of its origins, its history, or its historic impact. To this day, the literal or operational meaning of the generic term, quote-unquote, fascism, remains sorely contested. Some, including some of the luminaries of contemporary historical research, have in fact denied the generic term any real reference. So they're saying it only exists as a historical phenomenon of Italy in the 20s through the 40s, and that's it. There is no generic fascism. It was one historical movement, and that's all it was. Thus, while prepared to recognize some affinities between Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism, Renzo de Felice, one of the 20th century's foremost scholars of fascism, denied the reality of a generic fascism. Ernst Nolte, in his major work on fascism, while prepared to speak of a generic fascism, insisted on a studied distinction between the fascism of Mussolini and the quote-unquote radical fascism of Hitler. National Socialism distinguished itself from Mussolini's fascism by emphatic differences. Okay? So they are not necessarily, well, they're not of a kind at all according to De Felice, and according to Nolte, they share some morphological characteristics, but National Socialism is fundamentally different from fascism. They can't just be grouped together as two varieties of the same thing. Irrespective of the distinctions insisted upon by the most celebrated scholars, All too often, Italian fascism is simply identified with the National Socialism of Adolf Hitler, with both conceived instances of a generic quote-unquote fascism. Rarely is an argued rationale for such usage provided. It has simply become a matter more of custom and usage than historic confirmation, a practice inherited from the time of the Second World War, when the industrialized democracies found themselves embroiled in a desperate and protracted, quote, war against fascism, end quote. Now, I like this paper a lot. There's a few things that I would disagree with, but I think that places like this in his paper, he's really getting to the heart of the issue. A couple of times later on, he's going to kind of throw up his hands and say, why did this happen? You know, we don't really truly understand it, but we do actually understand it. And that's why I'm reading this to you, I guess, in part, is because today, right now, we are still living in, as I've been arguing previously, this era that was established in the pre-war period. So this propaganda campaign against right-wing ideology, against fascism, against hate, all of this garbage was started in the 1930s by Marxists, by liberals, these people were characterized as such, and it just never stopped. What he's getting at, though, is in the 60s and 70s here, these scholars actually made some progress in trying to pull out the historical and politically, ideologically relevant components of fascism from the history. So they started to pull the history out of the propaganda using scholarship and research and scientific method in their own historical field. So let's see how that worked out for them. In fighting that war to identify the enemy without distinctions as perfidious, racist, anti-humane, and irredeemable was a major propaganda convenience. Okay, so we don't know if they actually were perfidious, racist, anti-humane, and irredeemable, but that's what the propaganda machine produced. Hitler's National Socialists could easily be so characterized. Whether Mussolini's fascists or the Imperial Japanese could be so typified without significant qualification was a matter of little practical concern to the Allied powers, who were more occupied with winning the war than making fine historical distinctions. Really wasn't a fine distinction at all. It's an important distinction, so he's giving them too much credit, in my opinion. As for the intellectuals of the period, there were a significant number of shared properties between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy that the identification could be advanced without excessive intellectual discomfort. Well, I mean, how much intellectual discomfort does a Marxist get when a Marxist lies, right? Both European regimes opposed representative democracy. Both insisted on ideological conformity. Both were led by quote-unquote charismatic leaders. Both were nationalistic. Both were militaristic. Both employed controlled information to create and sustain popular support. Both were bellicose. Both were irredentist, and both were anti-communist. That seemed to constitute a constellation of traits sufficient to license the use of the generic quote-unquote fascist to cover both Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism. Given all that, in the context of a war for survival, the facile identification of fascism and National Socialism was only to be expected. What that identification did not address, of course, were the clear and cognitively significant distinctions between the regimes. De Felice suggested some of the consequences. Appalled by the singularly horrific consequences of Hitler's racism and anti-Semitism, and the ready identification of fascism with National Socialism, both were characterized by the same moral disabilities. That tended to support an interpretation that saw both Italian fascism as well as Hitler's National Socialism as instances of a, quote, collapse of Western moral values, end quote. And so you can't really use the example of the biggest one that everyone knows, which is the Holocaust and the 6 million figure. You can't really use that as an example because all of this propaganda, I'm telling you, was laid down in 1932, 33, 34, 35, 36, etc. So all of this stuff had already been decided. And if you look at all of the mainstream Orthodox Holocaust historians, they all agree there was no plan. Okay, this is what the mainstream Orthodox Holocaust historians say. All of the Jewish academics, the non-Jewish academics who work in the mainstream institutions in America and Britain and everywhere else. There was no plan to exterminate the Jews before 1941. Okay. Before that, all of these same historians agree that the Germans merely wanted to get the Jews out of Germany, get them to Palestine, Madagascar, America, Soviet Union, whatever. So this propaganda never hit a speed bump. You see what I'm saying? From the point at which the Germans wanted to create a German ethno-state, which is basically the same goal as what the Zionists wanted to create, right? We're going to expel the people from an area that we don't like, and we're going to make an ethno-state. Same goal as Zionism. From that point to what the mainstream historians say, which is we're going to exterminate everybody we don't like, there was never a speed bump in the anti-National Socialist or anti-quote-unquote fascist propaganda. It had already been laid down in 1932-33, and it just continued rolling once in, I think, 1942-43, the Allied propaganda machine added on these claims that the Germans were killing millions of Jews through suffocation, electrocution, carbon monoxide gassing, carbon dioxide gassing, whatever the claims happen to be. You can read about them in the primary literature. But so that stuff never changed. So what I'm getting at is in 1932 and 33, etc., this so-called collapse of Western moral values had already been alleged against the Germans and against the so-called, fascist, including all the right-wing regimes, right? So apparently trying to create an ethno-state was against Western moral values, even though Zionism doesn't conflict with that. So my thesis here is that most of this anti-German propaganda is really the emanation of geopolitics, and it's following along with the geopolitical motives, and that's why they're carrying on this anti-fascist crusade. It's not because the fascism or National Socialism actually were a collapse of Western moral values, but simply because the so-called Allies had to try to destroy them, and black propaganda is one of the British and American specialties, particularly British. Okay, sorry for that long discourse. Generic fascism was understood to be the result of a lapsed moral conscience on the part of Central and Southern Europeans, even immediately prior to the Second World War, more emphatically during that war, and for not a considerable time thereafter. The fascists, as quote-unquote enemies of Western civilization, were in effect demonized, identified as peoples who had forsworn Christianity and who had suffered grievous psychoanalytic and psychiatric morbidities. There's a lot to say here. The Bolsheviks, the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, they somehow weren't enemies of Western civilization. They weren't demonized. I could show you some propaganda stuff that the British and the Americans produced that said, oh my God, the Soviets your friend, the Bolsheviks your friend. And this stuff about grievous psychoanalytic and psychiatric morbidities, that's the authoritarian personality. That is the result of the so-called self-defined Jewish science of Freud and all those other associated people who today we recognize as being the cultural Marxists, who said that white European heterosexual families create fascism, And what needs to be done is to disassemble the white European heterosexual family and either put the state in its place or bring about all sort of sexual looseness in order to destroy those components of the healthy, happy white family that lead to the development of fascism and lack of tolerance. So these people had these psychoanalytic and psychiatric morbidities, such as wanting to be surrounded by people like themselves and enjoy their traditional lifestyle. That's what is a morbidity according to the Jewish psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. And what did happen in the post-war period was that, you can consult Michael Jones on this, pornography was piped into Germany, and they were told that they were the most evil people on earth. So by telling someone that they're evil and assaulting them with sexual impropriety, you clean up their psychoanalytic and psychiatric morbidities. That's what happened. I don't know, guys. For both academics and laypersons, generic fascism tended to represent evil incarnate. Right? We're still there. We're still there today. There's nothing more evil than Hitler. Nothing more evil. Soviet Union, and those are those memes I showed you earlier, right? Stalin, whatever, Hitler, that's the real bad guy. For a long time after the conclusion of the Second World War, a substantial minority of laypersons and academics were ill-disposed to abandon such an apodictic moral interpretation of what had transpired. The mass murders associated with National Socialism, he's talking about the concentration camps here, in the context of just by the way, just briefly, I don't know if you know much about the numbers of the Holocaust, but in the immediate aftermath of World War II, Buchenwald and Dachau were both said to be extermination centers. Today, no one believes that. No mainstream historian argues that occurred, but people like Eisenhower, who then became President Eisenhower, him and many others were all saying that Buchenwald had gas chambers, and that all of the dead bodies that they saw in the concentration camps, which were mostly people who had starved to death or died of disease in the last 4 to 5 months of the war because of the Allied bombing campaign that we're going to talk about in the podcast series. They said that all these dead bodies were the result of German torture and extermination rather than the Allied bombing campaign that destroyed the roads and railways. So then you can't feed the people in the concentration camps, and then they slowly starve to death, and that's why they looked so bad, right? Why were they naked? They were naked because the other people in the camp took their clothes off after they died because they didn't want to freeze to death themselves. So anyhow, all this stuff was just used as part of the ultimate evil, and the pictures and photos were shown all over the world, right? So that's this idea of this ultimate evil. For a long time after the conclusion of the Second World War, a substantial minority of laypersons and academics were ill-disposed to abandon such an apodictic moral interpretation of what had transpired. The mass murders associated with National Socialism in this context of a dictatorial system, decked in all the trappings of violence and war, were sufficient to convince many that the moral characterizations were true of, quote, all fascisms, end quote. The many so convinced were to serve as teachers for post-war generations. They transmitted to their intellectual heirs a conviction that saw generic fascism as the monstrous product of a kind of moral madness. And so if you watch Schindler's List, I think might be the best example. There's actually scenes of German soldiers just like screaming, just showing complete insanity, just total madness. Whereas if you read the mainstream Orthodox Holocaust historians, they're all working very secretively, furtively, you might say, industriously, efficiently, to such a case that for, 4 to 5 million of the 6 million people that the mainstream Orthodox Holocaust historians say were killed in that event, there's no evidence. There's no dead bodies, there's no ashes, there's no bones, there's no nothing. And so the idea that these are two incompatible notions, right? Either the National Socialist Germans were extremely efficient, rational people, or they were nuts. And if they were nuts, they couldn't have carried it out. But if they were rational and efficient, then they're not crazy. So it can't be moral madness. So this doesn't match up. The judgments were so effectively transmitted from the wartime generation to subsequent ones that in general and until today, generic fascism is depicted in much the same terms. We've gone about 35 minutes, so I think we're going to stop here. But so far what we've covered up to this point is the idea that right-wing extremism, fascism, and National Socialism are brought together. The crimes of National Socialism have been attached to fascism and thus to so-called right-wing extremism, which is just anything that's outside of the Overton window to the right. And that this might not actually be justified. Taking for granted that the National Socialists did everything that they're accused of, why go after fascists for those crimes of National Socialism, understanding that there are significant differences between National Socialism and fascism, according to De Felice and Ernst Nolte. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed this. We're going to go through some more of this paper all the way to the end, probably with the commentary. It's going to take a long time. Thank you, Amid the Ruins, for allowing me to use your music. I don't know if it was too loud or too soft in the video. I guess we'll find out. And also, I'm going to be doing a collaboration, I think, relatively soon with MJ from Schism 206. And I'm looking forward to that. I'd like to thank him for helping me with some other stuff. And anyhow, I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully, we'll produce something good for you guys. Okay, thank you for your time.